roll tour through from Ohio to New York City. And en route, I was with some other young men who were also going to be West Point plebes, first year students. And it was there that I found out that every United States Military Academy student gets a nickname that his classmates give him. Now, I thought nothing more of it. When I was enrolling, the officer at the enrollment table called out Ulysses Simpson Grant. I just stood there. That wasn't me. He called the name a second time, a little irritably this time, and he said, Ulysses Simpson Grant. And I stepped to the table and I said, I'm Hiram Ulysses Grant. And he looked at the papers and he looked at me and he said, by God, sir, the United States Army says you are Ulysses Simpson Grant. And Ulysses Simpson Grant you will be. Are there any other questions, cadet? And I said, no, sir. Now, I was also thinking with the initials H-U-G, I could only imagine what my nickname might be. So I let Ulysses Simpson Grant go. I had no idea what that would what application that would have in my life 19 years later. But let's talk about the Mississippi River and myself. In November of 1861, I had been made a brigadier general. Now, I found out that I was a brigadier general by reading the local paper in Mexico, Missouri. And I saw that I was listed as one of the 7 brigadier generals that President Lincoln had appointed. No one else had sent me any communication. I read it in the paper, so I was a brigadier general. I was sent to Cairo, Illinois for the Southern District of Missouri, West Tennessee, Western Kentucky. I went to Cairo and assumed command. And when I got there, I sent a Colonel Oglesby into central Missouri and north central Arkansas to offset Confederate movements in that area. When I got to Paducah, Kentucky and Columbus, Kentucky, I found out about a troop of 3,000 Confederate soldiers that were on the Mississippi, the Missouri side of the Mississippi, and heading west. I could only assume that they were en route to Colonel Oglesby and cause him some problems. I did not want that to happen. So while I didn't have orders to go across the river, I didn't have orders not to. Now, let me refer you to my Mexican War experience. I was a quartermaster in the Mexican War. I did not have a combat assignment, yet I was in every major battle because I put myself in the battle, except one in the Mexican War, Veracruz. I went to the sound of the guns and gained that combat experience. I could have stayed with the supplies, but I went to the guns. So when I'm at Columbus, Kentucky, I assembled a troop, some 3,000 men, put them on 2 steamer transports and crossed the Mississippi River, went into Belmont. Now this was my first command in combat. I'd been in combat many times, but I had never been the man solely responsible for soldiers in combat. And my heart was pounding. My troops landed, and this is key for you. I sent a colonel with a sizable number of troops south along the riverbank. Now, in October and November of 1861, the Mississippi River was at the lowest it had been in decades. So it was very low. There was ground exposed that ordinarily would not have been above water. And I wanted to assure that I had a rear guard protection. I sent the colonel downstream a bit, told him to stay there until relieved. We attacked the Confederate encampment, a brisk fight. The Confederates ran, threw down their arms, some of them, and ran. My troops, I found, were much less disciplined than I thought they were. They began looting the camp, wearing the clothes and taking souvenirs. I tried to get the officers to get them under control because I knew the Confederate troops were still there. And indeed, they had evacuated quickly to a wooded area. When they saw that we weren't pursuing them, and I found out after the war that had we pursued them, they would surrender. But my men were too busy looting the camp, and the officers couldn't control them. The Confederate troops regrouped. General Polk on the Columbus side, the Kentucky side, sent a steamer of troops across to help the troops that we had attacked. They got across, I saw them coming. I tried to control my men, they wouldn't react properly. I ordered the officers burn the camp, and only that got them under control. The Confederates connected with the troops that we had initially attacked and came at us in force. My officers panicked. What do we do now? Will we surrender? And I said, no. You fought your way in, you can fight your way out. And we proceeded to fight. We moved to the transports quickly. When we got back to the transports, I have a horse shot out from under me. I had a horse shot out from under me. I had to get another mount. I got the troops back to the boat, the transports, waiting for us. Mr. Ogle, would you raise it up? Now, I was nearly captured, and I found out that combat really is a learn-as-you-go process. Because remember, this was my first combat command. When I got the troops on the ship, or the getting on the ships, I rode back south to get the colonel, whom I had positioned as our rear guard protection. And I went alone. Now, you must remember, this is November the 7th of 1861. It's early in the war. Later in the war, I would never have gone anywhere alone, much less would have been permitted to go anywhere alone. I rode south, got to where I'd stationed the colonel. He's not there. Nobody's there. So, perplexed, I wheeled the horse about to head back to the ship, and I find that I've got a Confederate force between me and the transports. Fortunately, there's a cornfield. I walked my horse over to the cornfield with it between me and the Confederates. What may have saved me was I had a private's greatcoat on. I was never much for military ostentation. And I had on a plain private's greatcoat. And I'm walking my horse. The Confederate troops saw me and raised their weapons. I took the horse to a gallop. And General Polk tells the colonel in command, there goes a Yankee. The colonel says to his troops, there goes a Yankee, practice your marksmanship on him. I was less than 100 feet away from him. Nobody raised a weapon. I pounded back to the ships. Then I found that the troop transports had left without me. They had pulled away from the bank without their commanding officer. One ship, though, had not yet engaged his engines. The captain, fortunately, recognized me, ran the gangplank out. Now, if you're familiar at all with the Tennessee or any river, the banks are sharp. The horse got to the riverbank, and it was a sheer drop. He took his front legs over the edge of the bank and rode his haunches down with me on the horse and slid down to the gangplank. Captain ran the gangplank out 10 or 12 feet, and I rode that horse over a single gangplank onto the ship. The horse apparently knew the urgency. So I was on the ship. Now, when I got on the ship, got the horse to an aid, and I went upstairs to the pilot's cabin, which is immediately behind the wheelhouse. And I tried to lie down in his bunk. I was too, some would say rattled, but I was too charged to lie down. I wanted to see what was happening. We were taking small arms fire from the Confederate troops. Now, remember I told you earlier, the water was low. So the banks of the river were above the ship when we pulled away from the shore. And they were firing on us. I was gone a few minutes, came back to try to lie down again, And on the captain's bunk, there was a bullet hole from the head of the bunk that went down to where the footboard was. Had I been lying on the bunk, I would have taken a bullet through the head. One of those small things that could have made a lot of difference. So, can you roll it up a little bit, Mr. Ogle, or down? There. So the troop transport had left without me. I had to ride the horse on the gangplank because the boats had left without the general commanding. And a little bit more, this last point. Up a bit, there you go. Something that I will reference to you briefly in a moment is that of the 3,000 soldiers that were in the Confederate force, many of them were Memphis natives and from the surrounding area. And this is where the war came home to Memphis for the first time, because a lot of killed and wounded were brought back to Memphis after Belmont. So Memphians and Memphis had their first deep draft of warfare. The empty chairs began to appear. The capture of Memphis. On June the 6th of 1862, Commander Ellet sank all but one of the ships of the Confederate fleet. Some say there were 7, some say 8. But only one escaped, and it was later scuttled. Memphis fell with one shot. When the Federal troops were raising the flag over the courthouse, one sniper fired a shot, missed, and that was all there was for Memphis. Now, in Memphis, there was a large Confederate Navy yard, and they were building 2 massive ironclads, the Tennessee and the Arkansas. The Arkansas, they managed to get out. The Tennessee, they didn't. They burned it to the waterline and destroyed it. So the first point with Memphis was they lost a very important naval yard, because the Civil War encompassed what we call the Brown Water Navy, the Brown Water War. No one had ever had warfare like this. Ironclads on narrow rivers. Instead of the deep blue Navy, we had an entire new naval concept. So the Confederates lost one of their key Navy yards. There was also a munitions plant here in Memphis that was making 240,000 or more rounds per day. They lost that munitions plant. We used it. There were more than 1 million federal troop entries and exits during the war in Memphis from June of 62 through April of 65, because Memphis became a massive troop and supply depot for the entire Western Theater. Everything would come down from St. Louis and above via the river, and we also had the railroads coming out of Ohio through Middle Tennessee, Nashville, into Memphis. So it was a disembarkation point for troops, distribution point for supplies. Memphis also became a medical center. There were 15 at least hospitals in Memphis. There were so many that they even began specializing in their treatment of what wounds that they would handle. And the medical aspect of Memphis has remained even after the war. Memphis became a major economic center, much to my chagrin, for both sides. After we had captured Memphis, Mayor Park said we are powerless to resist. Memphis never really surrendered. The mayor said we're powerless to resist, and we moved in. But when we opened the post office, days after we had captured Memphis, there were more than 1,000 letters mailed in one day, first day, and most of those went nowhere. There were, in the first month of our occupation of Memphis, there were more than 8,000 bales of cotton that were sold. Now, both governments, and you must remember, I'm in the middle of this, both governments were condemning the sale of cotton particularly, and other goods and materiel. Yet both governments were behind the scenes encouraging the sale, because the South desperately needed the money to buy the munitions and medical supplies and life supplies for the war. The North needed the cotton for the cotton mills, and they also wanted the other goods that the South was producing. So while I'm being told, stop the sale, it's going on. And I'm trying to stop the money from going south. When they first started selling the cotton, they were selling it for paper money, for greenbacks. And then within days, the southern salesmen here were demanding gold. They wanted gold. I said, you'll take money and not demand specie or you won't sell. President Lincoln countermanded that order. So we were selling cotton knowing that the money was going south. Estimates are that within the first 8 months of our occupation of Memphis, which would be essentially 1862, that there were $12 million in supplies. $12 million were sent to the Confederacy for supplies. And by 1864, conservative estimates are that the South gained or made more than $30 million for the Confederacy by selling cotton and goods through Memphis. We knew they were doing it, we couldn't stop the money going where we knew it was going. General Sherman said that Memphis was better for our enemy than before it was taken. The South really prospered with Memphis being under federal control. And General Washburn, who was also in command for some time in Memphis, said that Memphis was more valuable to the Confederacy than Nassau was. Well, we've got Memphis. I have my headquarters for the Western Theater here. And we had also more than 15,000 blacks who had been former slaves came into Memphis. We set up huge contraband camps and put a lot of those men and women to work. They couldn't at first go in the Army, but by 1863, they were able to be enlisted in the Army. So by 1864, more than 7,000 free blacks had become federal soldiers, weapon-carrying combat soldiers. And we had a huge training depot, or station here. So we had a training station, we had a disembarkation point for troops, we were a supply depot for the entire Western Theater, and a major medical center for the Western Theater. Now, after I'm here, I'm planning to go to Vicksburg. Now, originally, I was going to make 2 movements on Vicksburg. I planned to take the Mississippi Central Railroad and move south along the railroad, taking my supplies with me as I moved, simultaneously sending Sherman down the river to assault Vicksburg from the riverside and catch them in a pincher movement. Well, if you roll it up a little bit, Mr. Holton, a little bit more. December the 18th through the 20th of 1862 was a bad 3 days for me. Because on December the 18th, Henry Halleck, my commanding officer, sent me a telegram that said, President Lincoln has authorized and ordered General John McClernand, who was a close personal friend of the president, who was a congressman from Illinois, who was a Democrat that President Lincoln needed to support him in getting elected and then hopefully reelected. John McClernand had orders from President Lincoln to raise an army and have an independent command on an expedition against Vicksburg. That was the first I heard anything about that. I knew McClernand was in Illinois recruiting. I did not know the machinations behind the scenes, that he had been authorized to do the recruiting to raise an army to command himself. I'm supposed to be in command of the Western Theater, but not the way that was working. Also, General Forrest out of Columbia, Tennessee, raided my railroad supply lines, and along 60 miles of track, he tore up most of that track. This disturbed me. But I'm not nearly as disturbed as I was on December the 20th, when General Earl Van Dorn raided Holly Springs, Mississippi. as I had said earlier, I was going to move down central Mississippi along the Mississippi Central Railroad, while Sherman went down the riverside. I had $1.5 million of supplies in Holly Springs, Mississippi. Everything I needed to move south, and I had planned to move south soon. Earl Van Dorn burned every bit of it, all of it. So I'm in a situation that my supplies are all destroyed. I have a railroad torn up. I can't get more supplies. So I'm essentially dead in the water with going to Mississippi, down the Mississippi Central Railroad. Complicated by, I've got John McClernand, who wants really to be in command of the Army, who is coming back any day to take command of the force down the river. I went back to Memphis. I got here on January the 10th. I planned to do Vicksburg, the Vicksburg assault. I knew at that time it would have to be down the river. I knew that there was not going to be a central Mississippi push. I did send Grierson on a raid from LaGrange, Tennessee, about 60, 70 miles east of here, down through central Mississippi to distract Pemberton's troops. And he was very successful. So I knew that I'd go down the river. I moved troops down across the Mississippi here and marched them down on the west bank to Milliken's Bend, Louisiana, south of Vicksburg, and waited then for the Navy to run the gun batteries at Vicksburg, and they did so. So then, on April the 29th and 30th of 1863, I had 33,000 men. And all day, all night, and all day, we moved 33,000 troops from Milliken's Bend, Louisiana to Bruinsburg, Mississippi. And that was the largest troop amphibious military movement in history. And it was the largest military amphibious movement until June 6, 1944, with the D-Day invasion, which I hope gives you a perspective on what a massive job it was in less than 48 hours using steamboat and transports, 2 transports, to move an entire army of 33,000 men, arms, equipment, wagons, horses, mules, supplies, in 2 days. So at that time, I'm now across the Mississippi on the Mississippi side, and I'm south of Pemberton. Now, to sum up that very briefly, instead of going due north from Bruinsburg up the Mississippi coast, or river rather, river bank, I went northeast to Jackson, Mississippi, and then wheeled back west, which was my original plan, to go to Jackson and then go west into Vicksburg. And fought 4 battles and pushed Pemberton back into Vicksburg. I fought 4 battles in 5 days and won every one of them. So you see how the Mississippi and my career were so entwined. I had my first combat command on the Mississippi. Horse shot out from under me, nearly got shot myself, almost got shot in the bump. The boats left without me, had to ride a horse up a gangplank. Came to Memphis, had all my supplies burned at Holly Springs with Van Dorn, forest burning, tearing up my railroad tracks in Middle Tennessee, and McClernand trying to take my job from me and take an army out from under me. So by moving south before McClernand got back, he couldn't do that. Take Vicksburg, went south of Vicksburg, crossed from Louisiana over to Bruinsburg, Mississippi, and then proceeded to wedge Pemberton with his back to the Mississippi. So the Mississippi looms large in my military career. And at this time, if you have any questions, I'd be happy to entertain any questions.